I will pay you $2 million if you read this document. The words hung in the air like a dropped coin. They landed on leather chairs, on a polished podium, on the scattered programs people fanned themselves with while they waited. The registration hall smelled of coffee and new carpet and the faint antiseptic tang of a room cleaned for important people. Cameras leaned forward. Phones crept up on sticks like curious insects. Thomas Whitman said it to make a point. He said it with a slow hand, rubbing the flat of a paper he had set between him and the microphone, as if the page were a prop and the money an abstract punctuation mark. He smiled the kind of smile that assumed everyone was playing the same game, that the rules of the room were his to define. Anna Moore watched the paper. She watched the numbers, the columns of dense type. She watched the small black letters make patterns she recognized. She was 6 years old, and her hands were still the kind that fit inside her grandmother's. They were also the hands that had learned to feel the difference between an I and a J, between a P that pushed down and an R that stuck up. She had learned letters like someone learns to know a friend's face, patiently, at her own speed, one small hello at a time. When Whitman spoke, there was a beat in which the room laughed. It was the kind of laugh that meant, "That will never happen." Billionaires made headlines. Children bought cereal with cartoon prizes. They did not accept bets in public and then win them. Evelyn Moore's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Her knuckles were pale there, and she did not laugh. She had not come to the hall for spectacle. She had come because Anna wanted to enter a competition open to any reader. She had come because the regional literacy group had posted the call-out on a notice board at the library, where Anna's small hand most days found her way to picture books and bilingual labels on loanable dictionaries. Evelyn remembered the first time Anna surprised her, forming a sentence that was not simply a mimic, but a sentence with a mind of its own. The memory softened something in Evelyn. It was also practical. She understood the social geometries of attention. She could smell danger when bright lights aimed a child into a public frame. Anna stepped forward when they asked for volunteers. Her shoes were scuffed, the kind of scuff a child gets from running between a bus stop and the corner store. She had been in and out of language since infancy. Spanish soft-syllabled from Evelyn's mother, English on television and at school. A lullaby in Tagalog her neighbor had hummed once. 7 languages were in her head like stones in a pocket. She had not counted them until Whitman set the coin on the table. "Would you like to read this one, Anna?" the moderator asked, leaning down to meet her small height. Anna looked at the paper and then at Evelyn. Evelyn nodded once. It was the small gesture of permission that in their life meant, "You decide." She tightened her hold on Anna's backpack strap, then let go. Anna took the paper the moderator extended. The hall hummed with 1,000 small noises, shoes, a rustle, a camera shutter, the breath of 100 people who could not believe they were holding their breath. She read. Her words came steady and clear. They did not have the polish of performance. They had the simple clarity of someone who had learned language as a tool rather than a showpiece. She moved through the dense document, an administrative memo legally phrased, full of clauses and commas. With the same quiet, deliberate patience she used to work puzzles at the kitchen table. She pronounced unfamiliar consonant clusters, like a child pronouncing a long word, whose shape she had discerned only by touching it with her tongue. She mapped rhythms of foreign syntax, the way she mapped the curve of a neighbor's cat. She read Spanish and then English, then another tongue with soft vowels that were almost song, then back to English. 7 different cadences flowed through her small voice and did not clash. They braided. A few people laughed at first, indulgently. Then the laughter faded. The microphones held on her. Faces that had been amused rearranged into blankness. A man with a camera stopped mid-shot and blinked. Whitman's mouth moved into a smile that did not reach his eyes. He had not expected a child to do this. He expected spectacle, a photograph, a clip to be shown and disposed of. He had expected novelty. He had not expected competence that made everyone else's assumptions look shabby. When she finished, there was a long silence the room did not know how to fill. It was the silence of a space waiting for instructions on how to believe. It was the silence of people realizing they had witnessed something that refused easy narrative. Anna folded the paper with small, precise movements and handed it back. She said simply, "Words don't care how old you are." It was not a manifesto. It was a sentence a child might say, the kind of truth a child is allowed to say because they are not yet trained to polish it for impact. It landed the same. Whitman blinked. He looked at his advisers as if to ask the question aloud that had not yet formed in his head. Who brings a child into this and lets her speak like that? Daniel Reeves saw the expression and moved. Reeves was the kind of assistant who could make discomfort into a script. His phone surfaced, notes to publicists, a quiet calculation about risk and reward. Whitman's smile tightened, as if to keep from contracting into something less composed. Evelyn felt the air turn taut. She moved a finger under Anna's elbow, guiding her back toward the chair, like a shepherd returning a stray lamb. She did not speak. She does not speak when she needs to listen. Evelyn had learned in years of parenting and then caring for a child where there had been a messy past with other people's judgments, that words paled against presence. She would say what needed to be said in time. For now, she let Anna return to the small island of safety. The clip was short. Someone's phone had caught the end of it, the part where Anna read in another language and then looked up with that plain sentence that landed without ornament. The clip threaded through social feeds with a speed that made Evelyn feel dizzy. On some phones it was captioned with wonder, on others with the question, was this staged? Had the child been coached? Was this the trick of a precocious kid and a billionaire with a camera that liked surprises? Whitman's people circulated a different seam of messaging. An informal demonstration, Daniel Reeves said into a microphone that suddenly existed because things wanted to be explained. We staged this to highlight accessibility in reading. It was the kind of language designed to make people step back and forget to ask for proof. Whitman himself struck a posture of bemused detachment when cameras found him. He said blunt things about inspiring moments and supporting literacy, as if the two were interchangeable. His publicist posted a photo of his hand tapping the edge of the paper. On social feeds, the number 2 million kept appearing. $2,000, bold, a figure that gleamed like a coin. Inside the crawl of small commentary, Evelyn heard threats and proposals in the tone of courtesy. Reeves called, then called again. He offered quiet evaluations, private scholarships, an invitation to meet with a foundation expert who could assess development pathways. He suggested opportunities that, if accepted, would reroute attention from a spectacle to a consultative relationship. An offer of protection wrapped in the authority of someone who wanted to control the framing. Evelyn said no. She said no because a promise made in public, she believed, required public accountability. She said no because private assessments meant seizing the narrative and, in her experience, erasing the agency of those whose lives were the objects of curiosity. She was not naive about money. She had applied for small grants to keep Anna's school trips funded, had waited in lines for applications that took months to process. Her refusal was not a refusal of help. It was a refusal of strings tied invisibly into a child's exposure. She had seen how offers that came in closed rooms tended to study and then reframe people into the models that made funders comfortable. Anna was not a model. She was a person. Reeves tested for a softer approach. "We can arrange an independent review," he said. "We can set up a panel." The language was precise, measured in a tone meant to reassure. Evelyn's answer was simple. If there is going to be a review, it will be public. No private evaluation. No side deals. This started in public. It will be settled in public. The insistence surprised some. Many people assumed a parent would take the private option to secure benefits, to reduce the trauma of visibility for a child. Evelyn had not come to the hall unaware of fear. She knew the cost of exposure. She had, perhaps unfairly, an old scarred sense that power liked to bend favors into silence. But she also saw the larger geometry. Whitman had made a public statement with a public figure. If he wanted the benefits of spectacle, attention, applause, the relief of seeming generous, then he needed to accept the accountability that attached. The clip gained traction. Memes grew around it. A split frame with Anna reading on one side and a picture of Whitman's typed offer on the other. Comment threads braided triumph and suspicion. Some voices cheered Anna as if she were a banner for every child with a scarred access route to opportunities. Others insisted there must be a trick, a prepared reading coach, a producer's hand. The split on social media reflected the split inside the building committee that oversaw the reading competition. They were used to dealing with procedural challenges about eligibility, about scoring rubrics. They were not used to the politics of a billionaire making the rules in public and then suggesting he might prefer a different ending to the story. Margaret Hale read the small clip once, twice, and then started the work she had done for decades, the work of noticing the parts that did not fit the neat versions people offered. Margaret was retired and precise, a reporter who kept a little notebook with sharp edges. She had a habit of writing down the time a phone call was made, who made it, and with which words. She knew the utility of a timeline in a world that liked to smooth difficult sequences into tidier stories. When Evelyn called Margaret, she did not plead or dramatize. Evelyn's voice was low and steady. "Gracefully documented help or a string of PR stunts?" she asked. "If you're interested, there are details." Margaret asked for the clip, for the names, for the times. She asked for an account of the day, all the small gestures people often omitted, who had been in the room, who had laughed first, who had looked away. She asked for anything in writing, emails, the posted invitation, receipts. She wanted to trace the public record. Mrs. Alvarez, the librarian, became the next node of support. She was the kind of person who kept lists of overdue children's books and remembered the birthdays of regular patrons. She had seen Anna at the library the week before Whitman's event, circling the children's section, where bilingual dictionaries sat like guards. Mrs. Alvarez remembered Anna's attention to the labels and the way she rearranged stacks of picture books in an order that made sense to her small mind. "Kids read in all sorts of ways," Mrs. Alvarez told a neighbor that week, "and sometimes adults want to make it into a trick when it's not." Margaret's notebook filled. She visited the hall where the event had been held and observed the polished wood of the lectern and the faint smear where the paper had been placed. She emailed the committee a list of questions and noted the reply that arrived in the typical institutional tone: calm, factual, thinly hedged. Whitman's camp adjusted images. They posted a short statement about celebrating literacy and learning. They offered a photo op of Whitman with a box of books. They registered their concern that the public needed proper context about events undertaken in good faith. But they did not yet make a public retraction. The press machinery of someone like Whitman is not a blunt instrument. It is a set of levers and soft adjustments. People with deep resources know how to tune a story rather than extinguish it. Anna came home from the event with tired eyes. She had expected applause or a cookie. She had not expected the world to feel heavier afterward. Evelyn watched the exhaustion fold into her small shoulders. The child wanted to know about the money, in the way children do, because money can be a container for immediate, tangible things. A new pair of shoes, an art set, a quieter night for Evelyn if the bills never quite stacked against them. "It's $2 million, Anna said, as if practicing the shape of the number. 2000. She pronounced the zeros like little circles she could trace with a finger. Evelyn crouched and made herself level with Anna. She felt the weight of the number the way a person feels thunder in a far distance. "We don't make plans on the basis of somebody else's words," she said carefully. "We make plans on what we hold. But you were brave." "That's not the same as brave when you're on stage," Anna said, then corrected herself because she was 6 and still learning how comparisons were made. It felt like listening and speaking at the same time. Evelyn thought of the soft, tidy ways people tried to explain away things they had not expected. She thought of Reeves's tone. She thought of Whitman's smile. She had no illusions about how the next days would play out. At home, the television showed the clip as a soundbite between segments, less than a minute of a child who could be framed in many ways. Opinion hosts argued. Comment sections boiled. The clip's loop was relentless. In the small-town neighborhoods, neighbors watched and discussed in grocery lines and on stoops. Some cheered, some were suspicious, most were exhausted by the spectacle. Margaret wrote her initial piece with restraint. She quoted the line about the 2 million in the opening paragraph because it was the fulcrum of the whole thing. She wrote about the biases that a promise like that reveals, that certain people imagine other people as sources of novelty rather than of agency. She interviewed Mrs. Alvarez and tied the anecdotal scenes of the library to a larger picture of access. She asked the committee why a publicly posted offer required private reassessment. She held the sentence at the center, the one Anna had said, and let it make the point. When the piece went live, the tenor of the conversation shifted. Not everywhere, but in pockets where people read it, there was a new vocabulary for the story: accountability, public promise, and the ethics of spectacles. Margaret's reporting was not a demolition. It was a careful mapping of what had happened and of the choices people were making in response. The committee convened in a conference room with a long table and a camera placed at the far end for transparency. Their emails had been sharp and procedural. "We must ensure fairness. We must protect minors. We must adhere to guidelines." Behind the bland language, the conversation was about optics and risk. Claire Henson, the compliance officer, read from a list of recommendations she had prepared: protective tracks for underage participants, private evaluations to confirm developmental readiness, the possibility of a separate youth division that would prevent direct competition with adult entrants. Evelyn watched the committee minutes, as if she could feel the fabric of the decision being stitched. She attended the hearing not to argue spectacle, but to insist on place. This was a public offer, she told them, a public offer made directly. If you decide to move her aside for private assessment, you are changing the terms of what was promised in view of an audience. Claire Henson's voice was clinical. "We have obligations to ensure the safety and welfare of minors," she said. "We must consider the child's psychological impact and the integrity of the competition." Evelyn did not take the bait of rhetorical warfare. She spoke of Anna as a child who loved words, who had practiced at home, who had earned the place she asked for with her voice. She insisted that safeguards be a matter of procedure, not a pretext to move a child to a private stream that would erase the public promise. The committee wavered. There were reasonable concerns: safeguards that would protect Anna from invasive publicity, rules about media access, staging areas closed to the press. There were also suggestions that sounded like side doors, private scholarships, quietly curated experiences, retreats designed to keep a child away from the glare. The difference between a protection and a pretext is in who controls the terms. Evelyn could see what was being offered. She would not let Anna's agency be traded away in polite language. The days widened, and the clip's reach thickened. Some advocates praised Anna as a symbol of talent hidden in overlooked places. Others scalarized the incident, turning it into a parable of elite power, making a spectacle of the less powerful. Headlines used the phrase "billionaire's bet" with the casual cruelty of those words. They were, to Evelyn's mind, half-truth. Whitman had pitched it like a bet. For Whitman's camp, the language of a bet had the advantage of a wink. The risk is his, the publicity is his. The story folds into a tidy anecdote about generosity and whimsy. But for people like Evelyn and Anna, the bet was less a game and more a test. Who would be permitted to finish a sentence that had been started by someone in authority? Reeves kept calling. He sent a list of suggested next steps that read like grant applications layered over a PR plan. Whitman's statement softened over successive versions, as statements in crises often do. First defensive, then conciliatory, then carefully non-committal. "We support the development of literacy opportunities for children in all communities," one read. "We are exploring effective and ethical pathways to contribute," another said. The language suggested action, but attached it to unspecified conditions. It was the kind of philanthropy that tasted of good intentions and still left the structural decisions in the hands of the donor. In the kitchen that night, Anna lay flat on her back across the living room rug, reading from a wordless picture book. She had spent the day conversing with sentences in tongues most people at the dinner table did not know. Now she made the sounds of pages turning and the soft hum of a child content in a small ritual. Evelyn sat on the couch and watched the quiet geometry of her life. Dishes in the sink, a calendar with stickers for school events, and a window that looked onto the neighbor's yard where a child practiced soccer. "This is getting bigger," Anna said, not stopping her page turning. She named the obvious in the way a child names the sky. She had seen more faces on screens than she used to. She had overheard the adult tangle of words like ethics and controls and panels. Evelyn folded the evening's mail. She had a list of practical moves she was making, not dramatic ones, letters to the committee, an insistence that any assessment would be transparent, contact information for a community councillor who would be present if public stages became too bright. She had reached out to Mrs. Alvarez to coordinate a quiet reading group that would remain small and voluntary. She had agreed to meet Margaret Hale for coffee the next morning. She had declines ready for Reeves that emphasized public procedure over private favor. The next day, Margaret's piece went live with the kind of headline that did not scream but insisted: a public promise, a child's voice, and what's owed. It traced Whitman's words, the moment of the reading, the ripple, and the exact sequence of outreach Reeves had made afterward. Margaret's style was not accusatory. It was a careful laying of facts that allowed readers to see the choices made in their context. The effect was not immediate upheaval. It was more like a new axis, letting people rotate their perspectives 1 degree at a time. Messages came in, letters, emails, a few phone calls from strangers offering small money and larger moral support. A retired teacher from a neighboring county wrote about a reading program she had once run. A teenager who had grown up bilingual emailed a paragraph about the dignity of being heard. The archive of responses felt like a hand of people lifting the weight of the moment a little. Whitman watched the pile of public sentiment with a face that reflected the complicated mechanics of notice. He could sense the public eye shifting in a way that made him uncomfortable. It forced him to refresh his statements and to send people, staffers who specialized in community relations, to model good intention. He was capable of gestures that resembled apology, a donation to a high-profile literacy charity, a speech about the importance of multilingual education. He was not, however, in the business of giving up control of the narrative he had started. Evelyn was not in the business of holding symbolic victories. She wanted a clear public settlement, one that recognized Anna's place and did not neutralize her agency into a PR campaign. She wanted safeguards for Anna's well-being. She wanted Miss Anna's reading to be recognized on the stage it had been promised, under conditions that respected a child's limits and dignity. As pressure mounted, the committee issued a provisional statement. They would convene an ethics panel. They would consider protective measures. They would, they assured the public, weigh public interest alongside the welfare of the child. The language was cautious, which meant many things and resolved few. Evelyn paced in the small apartment while Anna had school. She drafted a letter to the committee, polite and firm. She asked them to cite their guidelines for minors and to specify whether a public offer that had been made in the presence of an audience could be executed privately. She suggested a simple framework. If Whitman's claim had stirred public interest, and if a child had accepted in public, any resolution needed to be in public. It was a small request. It was not a demand for courtroom justice. It was a claim rooted in a principle that public offers carry public obligations. That afternoon, a message arrived from Reeves's office with the kind of timeliness people use when they want to show they are responsive. He proposed a meeting to discuss possible educational partnerships and tailored support for Anna. The offer was phrased like an act of charity. Evelyn saw the phraseology for what it was, a possible rerouting of agency into structures controlled by a donor. She sent a reply that was both concise and unyielding. We appreciate the offer. Any discussions must be transparent and be scheduled in a public forum or with documented public access. We will not accept private evaluations or private control of outcomes. The message sat like a stone thrown into a pond. First it caused ripples in Reeves's office, then it hit Whitman's ear, then it returned with a new set of proposed language meant to soothe. The exchange pushed the matter from a local curiosity to the problem of how public promises intersect with private power. The days that followed held a particular texture, tight, taut, a set of small, consequential decisions repeated like stitches. Anna returned to school. She read in the library corner during recess. Children greeted her with the chemistry of other children, some curious, some unsure. She answered questions with an economy that was sometimes wry, sometimes simply literal. At night, Evelyn found herself thinking about the responsibilities of those who managed resources. She did not deny that money could fix teeth or buy glasses or replace a broken heater. She also knew money, when wielded for image, could make invisible the very people it claimed to help. She wanted public reparation that restored dignity as much as funds that repaired needs. The glimpses of Whitman's most recent statements suggested he had not yet fully understood the distinction. Margaret's reporting continued with measured columns that made the small actions visible. The times Reeves had called, the committee meetings, the names of people who had offered to be present if Anna read on the stage again. The local news picked up the thread, and for once did not collapse the story into a single feisty headline. The conversation spread to radio shows and community forums, and with each telling the stakes became clearer. It was not merely about a prize, but about who gets to define the terms under which ordinary people step into the light cast by extraordinary wealth. Evelyn began to assemble allies. Mrs. Alvarez coordinated a small circle of librarians willing to testify about Anna's regular presence and reading habits. A retired community lawyer, quiet, practical, offered to attend the committee meeting as an observer. Margaret agreed to document the meeting. These were modest alignments, the kinds of things that exist in networks that are not flashy but are durable. Whitman's next public statement hinted at a constrained concession, a proposed scholarship, and a new literacy initiative. No details yet, but the move toward a philanthropic response was clear. It was the form of apology that people like him favored. Money attached to a brand, to a named initiative that could be photographed. Evelyn read the press release and felt the familiar double-edgedness. A chance to secure resources, a risk that these would be used to shape the terms of participation rather than to meet needs articulated by community members themselves. She gathered as much public documentation as she could. She organized copies of emails, the clip, the registration form, the program with Whitman's signature on it. She planned to bring a small file to the committee, facts, dates, and a request for transparency. It was an ordinary adult response to an extraordinary moment. Prepare the record, make your points clearly, do not flinch from insisting on the public terms. Morning light came, and with it a calendar invitation from the committee for a hearing the next week. It was billed as an open session for the resolution of participation and child welfare concerns. The phrasing, Evelyn thought, duplicated the problem. Child welfare had become a phrase used to justify moving a child out of a public moment. She resolved to be present, to insist that the process be fair and the outcome visible. The city felt taut as well, a coil of small voices ready to release. At the bakery on the corner, a woman who ran a bilingual playgroup argued with a neighbor about whether public offers should be judged by judges or by the people affected. In a second-hand bookstore, a cashier who had watched the clip on their break left a note that read, "We're here for the kids." Community organizers started a local petition asking the committee to honor the public nature of the offer. Meanwhile, Whitman moved toward the language of concessions that did not concede much. "We are committed to doing right by the child and to advancing literacy," his office announced. Reeves culled a list of potential community partners, the kind of list donors deploy when they want to appear collaborative. In his quieter moments, Whitman asked his aides whether the spectacle could be turned into a lasting program that bore his name. The question sounded like curiosity. It sounded also like the calculation of someone who believed the world required his stewardship. Evelyn read the press releases with a coolness that came from long practice. She knew how to parse language meant to soothe. She also knew how to make a small plan solid. She had a small list of non-negotiables that she would not move on. Anna would not be subject to private control. Any programming funded in the wake of the event would be community-led. Anna's participation would be on terms that respected her development and privacy. Anna watched the grown-ups, spoke about her as if she were an object balanced on scales. She did not like the term child welfare concerns. To her, it sounded bureaucratic and distant. At night, she asked Evelyn if the paper with the $2 million was still in the office. She wanted to see it again because it looked like a map she had already circled. Evelyn told her, "The paper is a paper. People decide what a paper means. We decide what it means to us." That sentence was as close as a parent comes to an explanation of principles. We define the meaning. We do not let other people's language make the map for us. The hearing day arrived with a thin rain. People filled the committee room beyond its capacity, sitting shoulder to shoulder. Cameras lined the back wall like unblinking birds. Whitman's aides were there. Reeves took notes. Claire Henson kept the list of who would speak. Journalists murmured to one another. Margaret sat near the front with the small notebook she used to hold the precise motions of moments like this. Mrs. Alvarez took a seat where she could see Anna without being in her face. Evelyn carried the small folder with the documented timeline. She did not rise and make grand statements. She presented the facts, then the small exact requests, clear rules for minors, public conditions for any offer initiated publicly, and the presence of a child welfare professional during any public appearance. It was procedural, precise, and unflinching. Whitman listened with a face that was not entirely closed. He spoke last, not at length. He expressed his admiration for Anna's abilities and his interest in contributing. His words were the kind that looped back into institutions, partnerships, initiatives, community-oriented projects, language that could be shaped into many things. Evelyn heard them and understood the danger and the possibility in them both. The committee took the hearing under advisement. They promised an immediate public schedule for further review rather than a private meeting. It felt like a modest victory. It was not everyone's metal-tested triumph. It was a cautious protection, a deferral that kept the moment in view rather than letting it be quietly rerouted. When the session ended, people filed out into the wet street. Reporters rattled off quick questions. Anna went home with Evelyn feeling the kind of tiredness that is not only physical. She had been under lights, microphones, and then the softer, colder light of public conversation. In the weeks that followed, a pattern developed. Careful reporting by Margaret, occasional crispy statements from Whitman's office, and small acts of community support that layered like bricks. The social media storm ebbed and swirled. Some people found heroes, others found villains. The committee kept their schedule. Reeves kept making calls. Evelyn kept a steady, pragmatic pace. Documents, meetings, small phone calls to people who could be present on the days it mattered. At a small table in a cafe, Margaret and Evelyn went over the timeline one more time, not as conspirators, but as archivists of an unfolding public record. Margaret's pen moved as she asked clarifying questions. Evelyn's replies were precise and unromantic. They were trying together to keep the story from being smoothed into headlines that erase the hard choices, the quiet resistances, the insistence that a child's voice remain on the public stage if that was where the promise had been made. Outside, the city moved as cities always did. Buses, dog walkers, the clack of high heels. The number 2 million remained on social feeds like a bright coin. Tempting, dangerous, luminous. For some, it was a promise of transformation. For Evelyn, it was a test of whether a public offer required public accountability. Anna slept with a stack of small language flashcards by her pillow, the edges softened by repeated handling. She slept because she was a child who had done something people misread and overread and then argued about. She slept and dreamed in shapes that looked like letters and streets in her grandmother's hands. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and made a list. It included people to call, documents to gather, and a small plan for how to ensure Anna would not be swallowed by the story being told about her. It was not heroic. It was not grand. It was work that looked a lot like patience. Outside, somewhere beyond their small apartment, the mechanism of spectacle had begun to bend, not toward resolution, but toward the slow calculus of next steps. Whitman convened a meeting. He wanted to stay image forward while tightening control. Reeves put together a menu of options that ranged from scholarships to a named initiative. He did not, in private, offer to step away from the narrative entirely. He was considering which parts to keep. Evelyn's response was to organize the modest rows of allies. Margaret with her notebook, Mrs. Alvarez with a list of kidlit supporters, the retired lawyer with a willingness to observe. They were small but steady. They were the kind of people who knew how to show up and insist on the ordinary dignity of procedure. When the next public document, another committee update, arrived, it read that the committee would convene a more expansive public discussion with community representation and child welfare experts present. It felt like progress. It felt also like a delay that might be used to smooth things away. Evelyn understood delay as a tool of those who want to wait for attention to wane. She had seen it used to keep funds in temporary pools and to make urgent matters sleepy. She continued to insist. If the promise had been made publicly, the fulfillment needed to be public too. The city kept spinning and, in the small corners of it, the real work of literacy, repairing a broken photocopier at Mrs. Alvarez's branch, sourcing bilingual picture books, recruiting volunteers for after-school sessions, went on largely unnoticed by the cameras. Those tasks required fewer headlines and more endurance. They required people like Mrs. Alvarez and a handful of committed teachers who would come on Saturday mornings to read with children who might not yet know they could read in more than one language. In the quiet of daily routines, small victories accrued. Parents brought in gently used books in Spanish and Tagalog. A local bookstore offered to match small donations for a mobile cart. The tapes of policy conversations were being recorded. Margaret kept promising to document the story with care. And somewhere above the day-to-day, Whitman recalibrated his approach. He began to imagine a way to be involved that would not require his voice to be the loudest. It was not a surrender so much as an adjustment, a recognition that being seen had consequences and that power needed to be met with requests for public accountability. Evelyn, for her part, did not give speeches. She did not mobilize crowds. She did the patient work of insisting that a person remain a person and not a project. She did not close off the possibility of support. She only demanded that the terms be fair and visible. When Anna asked late one afternoon whether the 2 million would buy lots of books, Evelyn hugged her and said, "Money can buy books, yes, but it cannot buy dignity. We will hold on to both." The phrase had the bluntness of a lesson learned over time. It was, in its way, the moral at the center of the story. There is money, and there is the right way to be treated when money hovers near people's lives. The next chapter of the public conversation was gathering force. Committee calendars filled. The press requested updates. Whitman's aides sent 2 versions of statements, one framed for philanthropy, one framed for damage control. Margaret drafted a long piece that would trace the moment from the initial offer through the public insistence on accountability. Evelyn prepared her folder and listened for the small signs that would tell her whether the city would honor the public promise or fold it into private management. The rain thickened on the window as another day closed. Anna drew letters on the fogged glass, tracing old friends with small fingers. Evelyn washed dishes and set an extra plate out of habit, a practice built from years of making room for whoever showed up. Outside, the lights of the city blinked like punctuation in a story not yet finished. The public, for its part, debated whether the spectacle of a billionaire's bet required applause or derision, and most of the city had not yet decided which it would be. Some people saw a child's voice, others saw a mirror held up to a world that assumed spectacle when it met a life it did not recognize. If you want to see how this promise unfolds, stay with the story. The committee's provisional decision arrived like a paper boat set on water, public, cautious, meant to float until the current calmed. They would not dismiss Anna outright. They would hold hearings with child welfare experts present. They would require a public schedule and limit press access in ways that protected the stage without erasing it. It was a compromise that kept the promise on the table and refused the neat rerouting Whitman's aides had preferred. With that small victory, the contest's machinery resumed its ordinary hum, only louder. Anna continued to train the habit that had always defined her relationship with words. Daily practice, small repetitions, a patient curiosity that made grammar look like a playground. But the stages she stepped onto were different now. The lights were calibrated, microphones tested. A counselor sat just off stage with a clipboard that made Anna feel like the grown-up adults around her had finally found a language for being careful. The preliminary rounds were held in public rooms with clearer rules. They limited flash photography. They required staggered interview times. They insisted the child welfare professional be named in the program and present at every stage. For Anna, the rounds were an unusual kind of homework, passages chosen with care, short extemporaneous prompts, and languages that asked her to move gently between cadences she carried like stones in a pocket. Her reading was still the same sort of thing that had startled the hall, direct, unforced, the voice of a child who had learned language as a tool, not as armor. She read law-like clauses and old proverbs, a poem in a language whose vowels rolled like a distant song, a paragraph in another language that tasted of soft consonants. She never strived for applause. She read like someone telling a neighbor the location of a missed bus, calmly, with the assumption that the listener would care for the information. Between rounds, she slept more deeply than she had before. The nights were noisy with adult conversations. Coverage, spin, offers in language meant to be soothing. Evelyn watched those words like a gardener watching weather. She let Margaret's reporting do its work. Small, steady, thorough pieces that walked the public through the timeline Whitman's handlers had tried to edit. Margaret did not shout. She traced the calls, the emails, the tentatives. Who proposed a private evaluation, who used phrases like tailored support. Readers began to see the architecture of a rerouting, checks and balances that could become shackles if not kept visible. Public opinion, which had been a storm, settled into currents. Some commentators insisted that the contest would be better with new protections. Others argued that imposing private screens on Anna would be to punish the very person the promise had lifted. Little neighborhoods organized phone trees to follow the committee's announcements. At a church kitchen, volunteers stitched a stack of bookmarks to be handed to participants. At the library, Mrs. Alvarez placed a sign, "We read to be ready for the world." Whitman watched the atmosphere shift and reached for the textual instruments he knew best, programs, initiatives, and the beginning drafts of what might pass for repair. He tasked Reeves with drafting a proposal for meaningful contribution that could be framed as a benefit without being a spectacle. Reeves produced a menu, scholarships, summer camps, naming opportunities. Whitman read it with a face that did not tell the whole story. In private conversations, he asked whether being larger in the narrative might mean listening less. In public, he kept the language of generosity and interest. The distinction mattered. Evelyn had said early on that she did not object to resources. She objected to the conditions of their delivery. The midpoint came not as fireworks, but as a shift in posture. Margaret published a piece that did something simple yet consequential. It compiled the public offer, the clip of Anna reading, the record of Whitman's subsequent calls, and a handful of witnesses. Mrs. Alvarez, a teacher, the retired lawyer, into a tight chronological narrative. It was not an indictment. It was a tracing. The article asked a small question in its lead-off. If a promise is made in view of an audience, can the speaker unilaterally change the terms when the subject of the promise is someone without the same access to power? That question lodged. It moved people in ways that spin rarely could. The committee found itself returned to the problem they had postponed. They scheduled a public reaffirmation. Anna would be allowed to continue under conditions that protected her, and the public would be shown how the committee would ensure safety without erasing promise. It was a choice to hold a contest in the light, the way you hold a fragile instrument, to see if it will play true. Anna went on. The preliminary rounds widened into regional ones. They were televised in short segments that respected the time limits the committee had set. The TV hosts attempted the usual riffs, charm, shock, curiosity, but Anna's steadiness deflated kitsch. She read in a rolling series of tongues and then answered a question about why words mattered. Her answer was simple. They were maps. They pointed to where you had been and where you might go. She did not perform a lesson. She offered a map. With each round, the cameras moved a fraction of an inch closer to genuine curiosity and a fraction away from exploitation. Production teams learned that the best shot was often the one that let the child be normal. Her shoes slightly scuffed, her eyes flicking to Evelyn for the little nod that meant it was okay to continue. After a televised segment, some hosts praised Whitman for sparking a conversation. The line was familiar, praise that came without hard consequence. But beneath the gloss, the conversation had shifted. Many viewers began to ask not whether the billionaire had been generous, but whether accountability could be measured by the people affected. Whitman felt that shift. It made him cautious. He offered a public pledge, the outline of a new initiative framed in language about long-term literacy support. The pledge mentioned an amount, The $2,000 figure hovered like an impossible coin, and a desire to create structural improvements, yet how to ensure that money would not simply be used as a billboard, remained the question Evelyn insisted upon. She refused to trade the story of her granddaughter for a named centre whose control would rest with donors. The national rounds brought new pressures. There were longer prompts, questions designed to see not only fluency, but the capacity to think across cultures. Anna answered patiently. Once she was asked to read a passage about migration, an essay dense with personhood and policy, and then to speak about who gets to tell a story. She paused. A child's pause, a moment of eye contact, and then a voice that was small but not small-minded. "Sometimes grown-ups think the story is only what makes news," she said, "but stories are also the things we keep at home." She folded the idea into something literal for a moment. "My abuela sings in Spanish when she cooks. When I say those words in a room, it's not for applause. It's to be in the world with my words." The question asked by producers about unexpected voices was meant to elicit rhetoric. Anna offered candor. Her answer was not a political manifesto, it was a child's observation about where language lives. As the rounds advanced, fatigue came in small ways. She woke early and sometimes fell asleep on a couch between rehearsals. Her cheeks hollowed slightly, her smile thinned. Evelyn watched for the signal she had practiced with the counselor. They shortened interviews. They blunted the press's appetite for one-on-one access. They refused any on-stage stunts. At night, Evelyn read to Anna in soft voices, Spanish, then English, then another lyric from a neighbor's lullaby. Those sessions were not for cameras. They were for repair. Margaret continued to build the public record. Her pieces included interviews with people who, in ordinary life, used words to build bridges. Teachers who taught bilingual classes, a nurse who insisted that medical forms in a parent's language meant better care. She framed Whitman's proposed initiatives as opportunities that needed to be governed by the very people they intended to serve. The narrative around the $2,000 began to change, from the billionaire's bet into a challenge to do the right work in the right way. The finals were scheduled in a large auditorium, more akin to a civic center than an arena. The production was quiet, stripped of flourishes. The audience was invited but limited and screened. There was a stage with simple lighting and a table for the judges, the faces of whom belonged to educators, community leaders, and a child welfare professional. Cameras were positioned to record, not to dramatize. Claire Henson sat in the front row with a clipboard. She had become less a bureaucratic obstacle than a steward of rules. Whitman was present, but he kept to the perimeter. He had the expression of a man who had been surprised into nuance. There were aides near him, but he did not speak much. There was a single, unmistakable truth about men with power. The world will always ask whether they will shape outcomes or simply give the illusion of change. That question hung thicker than any applause. The final round's prompt asked contestants to respond to a simple proposition. Talk about a time when listening mattered more than speaking. It was a question that invited humility and attention. Young people before Anna had approached it with memories and metaphors. Anna's turn arrived after a hush. She stepped to the center, toes slightly turned inward, and read first from a passage in one language and then another to show the jury the breadth of what she carried. Then a judge asked a follow-up. Why did she think listening sometimes mattered more? Anna blinked. She thought of her grandmother's hands. She thought of Mrs. Alvarez rearranging picture books. She thought of the way Whitman's paper had sat on a table like a coin waiting to be picked up. It matters because listening makes room, she said. If someone listens, they make a place where another person's words can live. If they don't, the words are like birds who can't land. It was the kind of answer that did not demand to be lauded. It asked only to be noticed. The judges conferred. They awarded the top prize. They cited not only fluency, but the way Anna used language to show the world how to make connections between tongues, between neighbors, between promise and responsibility. When the decision was announced, there were tears in some rows and a reserved clapping that felt like a public sigh. Anna received a certificate and a small framed program. She held the paper as if it were an object that meant both a thing done and a thing to keep. She did not raise the $2,000 banner at the podium. She did not need to. The applause was enough for a child who had been walked through a labyrinth of words and come out sound. Whitman did not leave the building immediately. He approached Evelyn with a careful expression. He spoke in a low voice about wanting to turn his pledge into real resources. He proposed that he would endow a fund, an animal literacy fund, Reeves suggested at his side, a name Whitman adjusted until it rested on a syllable he felt comfortable with, and that the money would be used to support libraries, mobile literacy units, multilingual materials, and small, community-led programs. He asked if Evelyn would consider advising. He offered naming rights in return. Evelyn listened. The offers were familiar shapes. She sifted through them in the slow way she had before. Would this protect Anna's privacy? Would it give community members real governance? Was the fund set up in a way that would not become a photo op? She knew how to read donors. She also knew that to refuse money outright would be to close opportunities for other children who would never be in the spotlight at all. "So long as it is governed by those who know the work," she said finally. "Not a marketing team." Whitman looked at her as if he'd been given new coordinates. He blinked once, then twice. He agreed to conditions Evelyn named, a governing board with community representation, including Evelyn, Mrs. Alvarez, Margaret, and a representative from a neighborhood literacy coalition, independent auditing with public reports, and a clause that prevented unilateral naming for the donor without board consent. He also agreed that Anna's picture would not be used for promotional materials without explicit consent, and that any programs aimed at the neighborhood would be designed in consultation with local librarians and teachers. He would provide the funds, but would not control the narrative. The concession was partial. It did not erase the earlier dynamics. It did not transform Whitman into a public penitent. But it did create a tangible structure that moved resources into places they needed to go, under rules drafted by the people who lived with those needs. Evelyn demanded, too, that any scholarship or program created in Anna's name be robust enough to fix practical problems. Bread-and-butter repairs to library roofs, funds for transportation to after-school programs, a mobile book cart, retrofitted into a van with bilingual titles, stipends for volunteer readers, and small grants for teachers to acquire texts in languages their students needed. Whitman signed with Reeves' careful read-through. The Animal Literacy Fund was born out of a negotiation in which public accountability had been the price of money. There were critics. Some said the fund was a way to paper over systemic inequities. Others said it was still a billionaire's name, ringed around a community's needs. Evelyn did not answer the critics with rhetoric. She went to work. The fund's first board meeting was held in a small, multi-purpose room at the library. Claire Henson attended as an observer at Evelyn's insistence. Margaret took notes. Mrs. Alvarez brought a list of immediate repairs. Whitman sent a staff person, but did not attend. The board set a priority list and disbursed a tranche to repair 3 neighborhood branches, to commission a mobile library van stocked with bilingual titles, and to fund after-school reading circles with stipends for educators. Implementation was slow at first and then steady. The mobile van, painted in bright, unassuming colors, rolled down narrow streets like a small insistence. Children clustered around its open side as volunteers handed out books in Spanish, Tagalog, and English. Mrs. Alvarez organized a Saturday circle where parents could bring their toddlers. A retired teacher led an adult literacy session in the evenings, and a neighborhood grant paid for translation of basic forms in health clinics. The fund did not remake the education system, and it never pretended to, but the money fixed roofs and bought new shelves and delivered books in the languages that families actually spoke at home. Anna returned to a life that was quieter by design. Her certificate hung in a corner of the living room in an inexpensive frame that Evelyn put up because children like to see accomplishments as a way to fold them into identity. She went back to school, to the same librarian who had first noticed her, and to friends who measured her not by the attention she had attracted, but by the way she could be counted on to share a snack at recess. She learned to say no to interviews when she wanted to. She learned how to ask for rest. Whitman, for his part, retreated from the front page. He continued to fund projects but accepted board governance that limited his voice in daily decisions. He made a speech at a launch event for the Anna More Literacy Fund that was careful and almost humble in the way public speeches can be. It mentioned listening more than giving and promised accountability. The language was not a full transformation of a man who had once treated a paper as a prop. It was, however, a recalibration that cost him some control. Reeves, watching from the sidelines, learned how to draft policy language that could not be used to reroute agency. The change belonged more to governance than to soul. The media's appetite dulled. Whitman's name still appeared in articles, sometimes critically. Margaret continued to watch and report, but the arc shifted from spectacle to implementation. Readers learned about the mobile van schedules and where to drop off gently used books. Volunteers signed up. In quiet corners of the city, the fund's work began to show in small ways. A shelf that now included children's books in 2 languages, a reading tutor who got a stipend and a bus pass, a librarian who could finally replace a photocopier that had jammed for months. The larger systems remained as unresolved as before. Schools still faced unequal funding. Policy debates continued in rooms far from the neighborhoods, where children learned to trace letters on warm tabletops. But for families near the library, the difference was practical and immediate. Kids had shorter walks to books. Teachers had materials. The mobile van meant a school could borrow dozens of picture books in a week. Anna, years later, grew with the quiet of a small person who had been allowed to be a child after being visible. The certificate on the wall kept its place. A photograph of a mobile library's open side, taken by Mrs. Alvarez and printed without names, sat on a shelf. Evelyn sometimes visited board meetings, not to control but to press for practical measures. More funds for transport, training for volunteers, an annual community audit with published minutes. The Anna More Literacy Fund's governance structure functioned imperfectly, as any human institution does. There were disagreements about priorities. There were months when the van needed repairs and the budget was tight. There were board members who thought branding was important, and others who found branding distasteful. The essential achievement, however, was that decisions were now made in a room where community voices had seats, and where a commitment to public reporting was not just a slogan, but a requirement. Whitman could influence, but he could not unilaterally shape the terms into a spectacle for his own image. In the week that marked the fund's 1-year anniversary, Anna was allowed, by her own choice, to attend a small celebration at the library. She read a short paragraph in 2 languages. Afterwards, she walked the aisles and chose a book for a younger child, carefully considering the colors of the cover and the languages inside. She handed it to the child with the earnest attention that had always been her way of giving. Those who witnessed it felt the quiet ripple of what had happened. Not a story with an ending, but a story that had nudged a few things in the right direction. Evelyn slept better. She still kept a practical list on the fridge. Maintenance schedules, mobile library routes, volunteer training dates. She still said no to offers that would tie the neighborhood to an image-driven project. But she also did the small, patient work of building durable things. A roster of tutors, an annual maintenance fund for library roofs, an emergency book fund for families in sudden need. Those were the scaffolds that made the money count. Margaret kept writing, sometimes about the fund's successes and sometimes about its limits. Her coverage kept an eye on the tension between philanthropy and structural change, the very thing Evelyn had said aloud months earlier. Readers learned that money could fix things in practical ways and that those fixes mattered, even as larger inequities persisted. Whitman occasionally visited a library event, usually at the invitation of the board, and under terms that protected children from being photographed without consent. He listened to a librarian talk about bilingual titles and to parents who described how small repairs had made an after-school program possible. He remained a complicated figure in public reckoning, not wholly the villain of some narratives, not fully redeemed in others. He had, in the end, accepted a loss of narrative control in exchange for joining a governance structure he no longer directed. That was a partial accounting, an admission that public promises, once watched, require public frameworks to be honored. Years softened the edges of the incident. The $2,000 figure still flashed in retrospectives, but people in the neighborhoods measured the story by other metrics. The number of children who checked out bilingual books that month, the number of weekends with reading volunteers, the repaired tiles on the library roof that no longer leaked during storms. The headline that had once been a coin became a ledger, small entries tallying everyday changes. Anna grew into school years that were less defined by media cycles than by daily practice. She joined a community reading circle and later, tentatively, taught younger kids to trace letters in 2 languages. She often sat beside Mrs. Alvarez at events, quietly handing out bookmarks. She kept a small notebook where she wrote phrases she liked. Occasionally, she still said aloud, perhaps to a friend, or perhaps to herself, "Words don't care how old you are." And people who heard it would stop and consider how often adults had forgotten that truth when they decided who got to speak. One evening, years after the original bet had bent into a fund, Anna sat at the kitchen table with Evelyn across from her. The framed certificate still leaned against the shelf. Outside, the mobile van's light blinked down the street as it made its weekly stop. Anna was practicing a short piece in a language that had become part of her musical memory. When she finished, she looked up and said simply, "We got books." Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Yes," she said, "we got books, and we got something harder. People had to remember to be accountable. That matters." Anna nodded, as if accounting for something that fit into a child's map of the world. "And sometimes," she said, "people listened." It was not a tidy moral. It was not a sweeping victory that fixed centuries of inequality with a single check. It was instead a cluster of small, durable changes. Repaired buildings, trained volunteers, a van full of books rolling down streets that had once seen them only in the imaginations of children. A governance board that met in a library room and argued about where money could do the most good. A child who had been allowed to remain a child after being visible. Whitman's name remained a footnote on the fund's founding documents, but the work of sustaining literacy fell to others who lived and breathed it every day. The Anamore Literacy Fund funded mobile collections and gave grants for teacher stipends. It did not pretend to replace public investment in schooling. It tried, instead, to be a patch where the fabric of resources was thin. In the end, the shock of a billionaire's bet had produced a different currency. Public attention turned into an insistence on public accountability. The $2,000 was no longer just a prop. It became, imperfectly and with negotiation, a resource oriented by those for whom small changes made big differences. For Anna and Evelyn, the story's measure was not photographs, but mornings. A child reaching for a book in a language her family used, a librarian turning on the lights of a room for a reading circle, a van that arrived and left with shelves lighter on the way out and heavier coming back, full of borrowed worlds. On the late summer afternoon, a few years after the final round, the mobile van idled at the curb, and children clustered like curious birds. Anna stepped out with a stack of picture books she had chosen to share. A little boy reached for one in Tagalog. His mother smiled and hugged him. Margaret, who had chronicled the arc from the beginning, stood by the van and watched without a notebook for once. She had learned that stories are not only chapters to be told, but spaces to be tended. Evelyn watched them all from a bench, the way a gardener watches a planted row. She could still remember the day Whitman tapped the paper with his hand and offered the sum the world loved to repeat. She could also remember how she had said no to private reassessment, how she had insisted on public terms, and how that insistence had become the hinge for a modest public good. The last image is not cinematic, it is domestic. Anna at the kitchen table, a small lamp, a book open, fingers tracing a line of text, a framed certificate on the wall. Nearby, a shelf with new titles in 2 languages. Children in the neighborhood with a bus schedule in their pockets that led to a van full of books. Those are the lasting things, visible, ordinary, and earned. If this story moved you, consider supporting local literacy initiatives in your community. Volunteer at a library, donate bilingual books, or learn where mobile libraries serve neighborhoods near you. Share the story with someone who cares about quiet justice and the dignity that comes with being heard.